Welcome to OIB-TAC's monthly webinars, where our presenters share valuable information and helpful resources to support professionals working with older adults who are blind or vision impaired. Let's check out this month's webinar.
The opening code is HAN. That's H as in hotel, A as in alpha, and N as in November. HAN.
Hello and welcome to our webinar today. We're excited to talk about sensory development, and I'm so pleased to introduce our presenter. He is I'm going to get it wrong, sensory development instructor. Paul, you're going to correct me, but Paul
Yeah, that's
Hastings.
okay. You're close.
Paul Hastings with the Carroll Center. So straighten me out. What is your official title?
Well, I am the sensory training. I'm the sensory arts instructor. I'm the sensory arts instructor.
There we go. So
Yeah, I almost forgot. I forgot myself.
Well, and we're so excited that you're here to talk about this subject because so many times when people lose their vision, there's this a misconception that our senses automatically become superhuman, which of course they do not.
Right.
And then also that it's just an automatic switch to start using your other senses. Well, if you can't see, of course, just use your hearing or your sense of touch. And it doesn't always automatically happen. And you're going to share with us today information to talk about the importance and the impact of training those other senses and helping people feel more comfortable using them and trusting them. Right?
Yeah.
So
Beautiful.
Well, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for inviting me to speak today. This is a really exciting opportunity for me because this subject is so near and dear to my heart. And you did a beautiful job of framing why this is important in our work and working with folks who are visually impaired. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about why that's so. But I'm just thrilled to be here. And I want to thank everyone who's participating today and joining us for giving up an hour of a beautiful, well, I hope it's beautiful where you are, but a summer afternoon. I really appreciate that. I'm reporting here from beautiful Cape Cod, and it's a gorgeous day here, and I hope it's nice where you are as well. Sensory development or sensory training, I'm going to use these a little bit interchangeably, but I want to give you an overview of today's presentation first. So I'm going to cover first, what is sensory development and what is sensory training? How is it applicable in the day-to-day lives of persons with low or no vision? What is its origin story? How did it come to be part of the rehabilitation program at the Carroll Center for the Blind? And I'm going to tell you about my background in a minute, but that's where I work. And then we're going to talk about some exercises that we have done over the years at the Carroll Center in sensory development. And after each of the exercises, I am going to give folks an opportunity to ask questions and really also to share your experience in working with your students or your clients in sensory development exercises. I would love to hear what you all are doing in this area. So the learning objectives for today's session are the following. Number one, to identify the function and purpose of sensory development for people with low or no vision. Number two, identify 3 applications for the use of sensory development skills in daily living. And 3, identify 3 sensory development exercises to help gather and use non-visual information effectively. Okay, so those are the 3 kind of broad objectives for the session itself. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. Again, my name is Paul Hastings, and I am employed at the Carroll Center for the Blind in Newton, Massachusetts. I started in this field in an art therapy classroom at a place called Boston Aid to the Blind, and that was way back in 1987. So I'm kind of dating myself here. I didn't know anything about blindness. I had never met a blind person before. I majored in art art in college, and this organization was looking for someone to work in the art therapy classroom as a ceramics teacher. And I kind of jumped into the deep end of the pool and loved the job. And all these years later, I'm still very much connected to that work through a kind of circuitous route, which I'm going to talk about. I was then I then entered the UMass Boston program, and I became a certified orientation and mobility specialist. And after that, I joined the Carroll Center for the Blind on their staff. And the Carroll Center is a residential rehabilitation program. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history, but historically we have served folks who are adventitiously blind, people who had vision and lost their vision. That has changed very much over the years, but when I first started back in 1990, that was the bulk of our population. And much of what I'm going to talk about today comes from exercises and training that was developed specifically for that group of folks. Anyway, after working as a mobility instructor for a couple of years at the Carroll Center, I went back and I got my master's degree in rehabilitation counseling at UMass, and I continued on at the Carroll Center as the case manager and counselor there. And from there, I left vision rehabilitation for about 20 years, and I worked in higher education as a student services professional. And one of my responsibilities was overseeing disability services. And I enjoyed that work very much. And then when COVID happened, like so many people, I sort of decided I wanted to change. And I went back to the Carroll Center to teach in a new program that they had developed called Sensory Arts. And I was so thrilled to have this opportunity. And if our executive program director, Dina Rosenbaum, is listening, I want to thank her publicly for bringing me back. Sensory Arts is a class whereby students are learning to sort of use their non-visual senses in project-based learning. So at the Carroll Center, people take classes in Braille and computer technology and techniques of daily living, et cetera, et cetera. But the sensory arts class is a class where they are picking a project that they are going to make themselves, either a woodworking project, a ceramics project, a sewing project. And the objectives of that class is to teach people to rely on their non-visual haptic skills or hand skills and to gather information and use that information while working on a project. And there's a great sense of accomplishment and sense of pride as people are gathering those skills and using them effectively, but also are making something that hopefully they feel very proud about. I still do sensory training and sensory development. It's woven very much into my course. And I also work with our mobility staff at the Carroll Center to integrate some of the teachings of sensory training into their work. Okay, so I want to just ask, before we go on, I would like to ask folks if you would, by showing a raise of hands on the computer, if you would let me know how many of you folks are VRTs, vision rehabilitation therapists. Just a quick show of your hand. I'm just trying to get a sense of the makeup of the group. And TJ, I'm going to ask you to help out with
So
this.
far, so far I'm showing two raised hands.
Okay. All right. And how about how many folks are orientation and mobility specialists?
One raised hand.
Okay. How many folks are teaching skills, daily living skills with folks in their homes?
A bunch are populating.
Okay.
I've got 5, current 6.
Okay. All right.
7.
Okay. All right. I just wanted to get a little bit of a sense of this and what the today's group is. Last question: how many folks meet with people in their homes as an itinerant service provider?
7, 8. 8 going once. Going
Okay, going
twice.
once, going twice. That's good. Excellent. I appreciate that. All right. So, in your work, either as a direct service provider, or maybe some of you are counselors or social work, there are lots of ways to integrate some of the things that I'm going to be talking about today. But what I want to do before I jump into the exercises, I want to share with you how I begin, or how we begin at the Carroll Center, by introducing this notion of sensory development. Okay. And what we're doing is we're trying to integrate this idea right at the beginning of a person's program. So, as I said, I work at a center-based program. So people are coming to us from all over the place to enroll in a rehabilitation program that could be anywhere from 8 weeks to 20 weeks long, depending on their goals. So I, in the past, have done the orientation session, and that means I get to meet folks very early on in the process. And what I would like you to do is just listen to what I go through with our new students, with an ear towards the things that I'm talking about, because as we get into the presentation, you're going to hear examples of these things. But I wanted you to hear how we sort of do kind of a soft approach to sensory training and sensory development with new clients. So I welcome the new clients into the seating area of our lobby of the main building at the Carroll Center. Okay, we call this the fishbowl because it's situated in an atrium which rises to a big skylight up on the 3rd floor of our building. And our building is housed in an old carriage house. We have a lovely old carriage house built at the turn of the century, which has all been retrofitted. Almost all of the classes and activities are taking place in this building. So I welcome the new students, and I acknowledge that this is, on this first day, that they probably feel very anxious, and they're probably feeling like this is going to be a stressful experience. I congratulate them on taking this step in coming to the Carroll Center. It's not easy for folks to leave their home and travel to a residential program. And it's an enormous undertaking. And I want to, as much as I can, put them at ease about what the experience is going to be like. And I congratulate them on being open to learn many new ways of doing things, right? Like your clients, many of our students have lost vision over time, right? Many of them are folks who had vision at some point in their life and have lost vision. Although we also welcome folks who have been blind since birth. I give a little history of the building just for kind of background. And then I explain that I'm going to orient the group to some parts of the 1st floor of our building. And I tell them that's what I'm here for this morning. I just am trying to give you a little bit of information about the 1st floor so you can start to be thinking about, information as you move about. I ask the students to close their eyes and just listen to what I'm about to say to them, right? And listen for the things that I'm going to be drawing their attention to, okay? So the first thing I asked them to do is to quietly sit in the seating area just for a few minutes, just simply listening. I asked them, what is it that you hear in the environment? What is it that you notice about where we are and the space that you're in, right? And many of the clients will answer, oh, I sense an openness, because they can hear noises above them. Or they might say, I hear footsteps all around me, right? On all sides. Or I hear footsteps above me, right? They often say they hear doors opening and closing. We have an elevator in the 1st floor. They can hear the bell, the ding of the elevator bell. And I tell them that at first, when you come to the Carroll Center, all of these sounds can be overwhelming, right? Especially if you've left your quiet home and come to the Carroll Center, which can be very busy, right? So I assure them that these confusing sounds are actually going to turn into helpful bits of information that are going to make them feel not anxious and stressed, but the opposite. It's going to make them feel that they belong in this space and that they can use this information as they begin to get their bearings. Okay, so then I describe the building for them, and I say the main building is a big fat capital T, And the seating area, or the fishbowl, is at the intersection of the stem of this T and the top crossbar, the top of the T. So I said, picture yourself in this map, if you will. There's a big giant T. You're at the intersection of the stem of the T and the top bar. And then I walk the stem of the T and I walk the crossbar of the top of the T while talking loudly so they can hear what I am presenting. They can hear and put sounds together with the shape of a T that they might have in their mind. Okay. The crossbar, I tell them, at the top of the T runs east to west, and it's filled with smooth surfaces. The crossbar of the T is flat, shiny linoleum kind of material. The lobby, in contrast, is carpeted. So I said, when you're in the lobby area near the fishbowl, you're going to feel the carpet underneath your feet. When you're in the top part of the T, the crossbar, you're going to feel a smooth surface underneath your feet. And then I say to them that there are two exits on either end of the crossbar, the east door and the west door. Each of those exits has a vestibule with a nubbly or bumpy rubber floor. The east door takes you to the tech center, which is our computer training center. And the west door takes you to the dorm and to Center Street, which is our main address. And Center Street's a busy street. So I let them take this all in, right? We're all being quiet. I'm sort of speaking in as kind of a soft voice. I tell them that when they exit the west door, they will almost always hear traffic, because when you go out the west door of the Carroll Center, you're facing Center Street. It's probably 300 yards away, but you can always hear traffic. And I said, that's different from the east door. When you go out the east door, you hardly hear anything. It's much quieter on the back part of the campus. And I said, think about the west door, that when day is done, you head out of the west door towards the setting sun and down towards your dormitory. And I remind them that the sun sets in the west. And when they go out on the west door at the end of the day, they're going to be walking, if they imagine this, into the sunset. Okay. This is a little device that will help them to really make a distinction between the east and west doors. Outside of the west door is a wooden footbridge, I tell them, right? And it goes over something that's kind of like I told you it was a carriage house. Well, there was a fake moat around this carriage house, and the wooden bridge goes over this moat. And that's a very distinct feature. I said, if you go out the west door, you're going to be on a little wooden bridge with wooden railings on either side. Very distinct, okay? And so I tell them, as they are moving about in the next few days, think about those landmarks, if you will. On the way to the west door, you're going to hear two important auditory landmarks. And I explained to them an auditory landmark is just like a physical landmark, except that you're going to be hearing it and maybe not feeling it. The elevator with its bell ringing is on the way out towards the west door. The kitchen, the back door of the kitchen is on the way out towards the west door. And the kitchen door is always open, and you can hear the refrigerators and freezers running constantly. You can practically hear those from anywhere in the first floor, in the lobby area. So I said, as you're moving about and you're thinking about how to exit to the dormitory, which is going to be important, think about those landmarks. Think about the surfaces that are underneath your feet, right? Think about the sounds that your feet make on different surfaces. And I said, these things that all feel very strange to you right now are going to become really helpful landmarks and kind of guideposts, if you will. And at this point, I might introduce the clock face analogy. How many folks here use the clock face analogy in their work with clients as an orientation tool, right? I see Stephanie, Raphael. Okay, good. Amy, I don't know what you did, TJ, but this is great. I can see everybody's.
Oh, they're using their emojis. This is awesome.
I love it. Thank you, everybody. Excellent. So for those of you who don't know, the clock face, oh, lots of people. I don't want to, I don't want to talk down to anybody and assume that you don't. But I tell clients, you're going to imagine yourself standing on the face of a giant clock, which this face of the clock is beneath your feet. You're in the center where the two hands would stem from. When you point directly in front of you, you would be pointing to 12 o'clock on the clock face. Behind you, right? Behind you, straight behind you would be 6 o'clock. 3 o'clock would be off your right shoulder. 9 o'clock would be off your left shoulder. Okay, and so on. Now, young people may not use clock face analogy anymore. And if they don't, I will usually incorporate other orientation strategies. But I know from talking to Jennifer that a lot of you folks work with older folks. And I ask people, are they comfortable using the face of a clock as a tool to orient themselves? But anyway, that's often a time that I do that. So anyway, after that, I kind of end the session. I tell them remind them we've heard a lot of sounds today in the lobby. And I said that these sounds are going to help them as they learn the way around. Remind them that we've heard sounds of the elevator and the kitchen and the doors opening and closing. I tell them that remind them that we've talked about what you'll find beneath your feet as you start to move about. And then I say one word about this and one word only. I'll say to them, what we talked about today is something that we call sensory awareness. And I said, we're going to be talking a lot more about this at the Carroll Center. And I don't go into any complicated definitions about sensory development or sensory training, but in a very, very practical way, I've introduced some very basic and important concepts, right? And hopefully in a way that they can start to make use of those things immediately. Even if they're not moving about themselves yet, they can start to listen to those things. Okay, so I wanted to bring that up because it's my predecessors, who I'll talk about in a little bit. They thought it was very important to not overwhelm people with the notion that suddenly they were going to have to be paying attention to all of the sensory output or input all the time and making sense of it all, right? We wanted to ease into this notion with our new clients. And if you decide to tackle this, and in a little while, I'm going to ask you, after we've done some of these things, I'm going to ask you how many folks are already incorporating these kinds of things, because I'm very interested in that. But it's a nice, soft way to introduce people to the notion of using their senses. So, all right. So what is sensory development? It's a discipline for learning to gather and use non-visual information. The skills acquired through training are essential in order to understand and engage with the environment and the objects in that environment. And they form the basis for orientation, both in near space when you're working at a task in front of you, and in broad space when you're moving about. So although we're going to talk a lot about orienting and staying oriented, I also am thinking about near space tasks, and I hope you will be too as we go through these things. The objectives of sensory development and sensory training itself are the following. We're helping people develop spatial perception, or we're helping them to develop and improve, right? Spatial perception, tactile perception, auditory awareness and processing, non-visual problem solving, orientation, and proprioceptive skills, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. So these skills are applicable to all people who are visually impaired. Even if you have a lot of vision and you're using your vision, you can augment your usable vision with this sensory information, right? And integrate these two different kinds of pieces of information. And again, I'm sure that many of you do employ some of these practices, and I'm going to ask a little bit more about that for your specific input in a little while. I do want to mention very quickly a brief history of how this got to be at the Carroll Center. Father Carroll, our founder, was assigned to be a chaplain down in an Army hospital in Avon, Connecticut, Avon Farms, Connecticut, right after the war. He didn't really know much about blindness, but he was sent down there as a chaplain. And he worked with a guy. Well, first of all, he discovered that working with these new blinded veterans, the ones that kind of were able to move about most easily on the campus were the veterans who could kind of create a picture of what was happening around them. And it was very obvious to him that some veterans were able to do this. And he kind of studied up on this a little bit. And he realized that some people were using information to create kind of a map, and then they were able to move through their environment more easily. And he wanted to incorporate this into what became, it wasn't when he got there, but it became kind of the first rehabilitation program. He was assigned to be a chaplain, but when he talked to the doctors and nurses and said, what are we going to do with these young men? What's going to happen to them when they leave? The doctors and nurses were like, wow, our job is to patch them up, send them home after we've addressed their medical issues. And Father Carroll I think he was just very struck by the fact that many of these young blinded veterans were needed more than just the physical medical attention. And he and some others began to put together what became really the first rehabilitation program. And he invited this friend of his named Bob Amendola, who was an artist who had graduated from Yale, to come over and talk to the blinded veterans. And Bob Amendola was a sculptor, and he was very interested in the feel of form and how it could, by putting your hands on something, you could start to kind of create images in your mind of what that thing was. And Bob Amendola loved meeting with these veterans, and Father Carroll kept inviting him back. And he was trying to help clients or veterans to really use their sense of touch and their own imagination and their visual history to create pictures of things that they were feeling. And he coined this term called videation. And videation was sort of like creating a picture of something, even though you couldn't actually see that thing in front of you, based on sensory information. All right, so why am I telling you all of that background? Father Carroll came back to Boston and opened up what became the Carroll Center for the Blind. It wasn't named that originally. And Bob Amendola came with him and stayed at the Carroll Center for the next 30 years and developed a full curriculum about sensory development. And it's his work and the work of his predecessor, a woman named Nancy Campbell, that we kind of use to this day at the Carroll Center. They each created some training documents, which I'll talk about at the very end of the program, which we still use, although some of the exercises are kind of site specific. So anyway, I wanted to tell you that because it's a long part of our history at the Carroll Center, and sensory development has always been integrated with all of the classwork and the coursework that's been offered at the Carroll Center. Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about a few glossary of terms, and then I'm going to go over 3 exercises with you today that we do at the Carroll Center with clients. Things that you could probably modify. I know you'll be able to modify these if you wanted to do these things with your own students or clients. I want to talk about a couple of quick terms very quickly because I'm going to be using them later on. One of them is kinesthesis. Kinesthesis is the perception of body movements and changes in position. It's often called the muscle memory or the kinesthetic sense, and it relies on sensory receptors in your muscles and joints and tendons to track limb movement and position without relying on vision, right? Kinesthesis actively focuses on detecting body movement, how and at what speed your limbs are moving at. So it's very important to sensory training and sensory awareness, and very important to the lessons that we're going to be talking about today. Proprioception it's a similar term, often called the sixth sense. It's sort of your awareness of your body in space, but it doesn't have as much to do with movement as kinesthesis. And then videation, I already talked about. That's a form of visualization based on information coming to you from your non-visual senses, right? It may be accompanied by recalling visual information from your own memory, right? A person might say, after walking with someone, a sighted guide or their mobility instructor, oh, this is like the path that I walked on as a child, right? Or, oh, I had a flower garden that was exactly like this, as they smell flowers, right? So it's their senses creating pictures in their mind if they have a visual memory. And then the last thing I want to share is mapping, the term mapping. Mapping is used for both formally and informally in almost every aspect of skill training with folks who are visually impaired. Mapping can be considered as a plan or a schema which organizes information about the environment in a shorthand fashion. It provides the basis for intentional rather than random movement. Okay, so for example, for those of you who are O&M instructors, you might ask someone, describe the route that we just made. You're teaching a person a new route and you want them to describe very briefly, is it like an L? Is it like an S? Is it like a Z? Right? People are starting, you're encouraging them to start mapping out where they are as they move through that space. And that's augmented by the sensory information that they're picking up. Right? Not only the landmarks that you might be pointing out as an instructor. Okay, so are there any questions before we get into our first exercise? Are there any questions about any of the things that I've covered this far? I wanted to set up a sort of how its sensory training is introduced at the Carroll Center, where it came from, and some terms. But any questions I can answer before we get into the exercises?
We are good to go.
Okay, good. All right, so the first exercise that has been done at the Carroll Center for 50 years is called TKG, touch, kinesthesis, and grasp. And that's why I wanted to talk about kinesthesis. So Barbara Mendel developed the concept of how these three functions of touch, kinesthesis, and grasp come together to fully use the sense of touch in exploring objects. Through these exercises, at first unfamiliar objects become a source of important information. It's particularly important for those new to blindness or vision loss. And Jennifer hit the nail on the head when she said at the beginning of this seminar that, you know, for a lot of people, you're helping them to be purposeful in their exploration, right? We're trying as instructors to help a person be purposeful in the way that they explore something tactually, or the way they explore their environment with their cane, or the way that they maybe are exploring items that you've put before them for a lesson you're about to perform, right? So think of this as kind of a purposeful exploration exercise. Okay, so TKG, touch, kinesthesis, grasp. In touch, the first, it's really just contact only, right? This is when you might ask a person to touch something that you've given them or put on the table, and they know there's something there. It's hard, or it's cool, or it's fuzzy, or it's pointy, right? So you're just asking them, what is the first sensation that you are experiencing as you touch this object in front of you, right? And then you're going to ask them to move your hand around that object, right? This is the kinesthesis. This is how they grasp this is how they, I shouldn't say grasp because we're going to talk about that in a minute. This is how they start to understand through movement and shape or through movement and motion what the shape of this object is. They might say, oh, this thing is has a right angle to it. It feels square. Or this thing is undular or wavy, or the surface is uneven, right? So we might prompt them by saying, what shapes do you notice in this object? By moving your hand across the surface of it or on the sides of the object. And then the last part is grasp. This is multiple touch points, right? Plus passive kinesthesis. So the minute you put your hand on it, you're picking up information. You can move your hand around one surface, but as soon as you begin to use, and you can use both hands at this point, grasp is giving you multiple touch points. This is when people usually have the aha moment. They might say, this feels like a ball, or this feels like a tube, or this feels like a shoe, or a pot, or whatever, right? This is when they start to put all of these things together. Now, this happens instantaneously for many, many people. But for people who are new to blindness and are maybe fearful about using their sense of touch, this is an important, very early on step to getting people to be sort of thoughtful about exploring things tactilely. So let me run you through a more sophisticated. By the way, you can do this with something very simple. You could give a client something like a teapot, or I don't know, a Tupperware container with something in it, right? As a way to introduce this. Give them something that's a little bit big, not tiny. You don't want them. You don't want it such that, like, if you gave them, for example, a car key, they're going to know what that is instantly, right? You want something that they can explore with both of their hands, okay? And it's a great exercise to get people warmed up to this idea of tactile exploration. Here's a more sophisticated version of that. When a student is looking for a door, maybe they're getting up, they're finished with you, or the exercise, the lesson is over, and they're going towards the door. They might go towards the door and feel a hard, cold object, but they discover after they put their hand on it, it's not the doorknob that they were expecting, right? With further inspection, they discover that the cold object is actually the hinge. Okay, they can feel it. A hinge has a very particular feel. It's got a tubular kind of feel to it. Instead of feeling disoriented because they were looking for the doorknob and they're not at the doorknob, the hinge provides a wealth of information. The hinge is attached to the flat plane of the door, and the doorknob will be on the opposite side of the hinge, right? The opposite side of the plane from the hinge. That is a great orientation point right there. And then you can ask the student, at what angle are you experiencing this plane of the door? Because once they feel the hinge or even the knob, they can start to situate themselves to the door itself, right? You can ask them, can they place their shoulders parallel to the plane of the door so they can walk through it when it's open? This instantly improves the student's image and their knowledge of the situation and the relationship to it. So that's a little example of TKG right there, but in a more practical and broader sort of spectrum. You reach for the door, you think you're at the knob, but you're at the hinge. And right away from that little bit, suddenly the situation becomes more clear to them. So I would encourage people to start, if you're thinking about sensory training or sensory development exercises, TKG is the easiest way to wade into this. Does anybody do anything like what I just described in their work with students? Any kind of low-level tactile exploration exercise? No? Okay, well then this is new to you. That's good. I feel like I'm introducing you to some new things. All right, so we're going to move on to our next exercise, which is more sophisticated. The great thing about TKT is you can do it anywhere, anytime, right? It's great for at home, outside, mobile, being in the car, whatever. You can do it over and over again. And it's you don't want to make light of the situation. You don't want to be saying, oh, like this is a game, guess what it is. It's really not about that. It's about them being more purposeful about the way that they gather information tactilely. Okay, so let's move on to our next exercise. This exercise at the Carroll Center is called the facial vision exercise. And facial vision is something that we called it, but it's also called object detection and many other things. And some of you may do this as well. Facial vision is using nerve receptors in your face and your hearing to perceive objects or their absence. And you're learning to trust and use this ability that will provide valuable information for your orientation. Okay? This is something that mobility instructors are probably well familiar with. Initially, this exercise is best done indoors in a quiet environment, at least to my mind, because when you get outdoors, there's so many things going on. But it's a great exercise to do outdoors after you practice it with your student. It requires two things. It requires that you have a flat, smooth panel, like a stiff piece of cardboard or maybe a thin piece of plywood. It should be 16 inches by 16 inches. Okay, so you can just use a big piece of cardboard from a box or something like that. And the other thing you need is a movable sound source, like a smartphone or a radio. Okay, now there are two principles at play in helping a client understand and use facial vision. And you want to explain this to them. And by the way, you all know this, but my outline and the notes for this lecture are all on this, are posted here. So you'll be able to read more about this. But the two principles at play are these. Cutaneous nerve endings in our skin perceive the presence of objects when they are close to us, right? This is something that we all kind of know about. You get a tingling sensation, right? Not only on your face, but even maybe on your arms or your legs if there's an object very close to you, right? This happens all the time, but we're not always aware of this phenomenon, right? And vision overrides this sensory input, right? So we're usually relying on our vision to let us know when we get close to an object, right? If your vision is no longer useful for that purpose, this is something that's happening in your body all the time. It's merely an issue, not merely, but it's an issue of making your student aware of this and harnessing its use. Now let's talk about sound a little bit. When sound bounces off an object, the quality of that sound changes. We've all experienced echoes, right? Some sound, like the movement of air, is so subtle that we don't perceive it as sound, but more like a feeling or sensation. Because actually, air is moving about, right? And when it bumps up against an object, you can sense a change, believe it or not. As we get closer to that object, the air between us and that object reverberates like a very subtle echo. We perceive this phenomenon from our ears and the senses in our skin, even though we're not actually hearing anything. We're not hearing that a real sound. We're really perceiving the change in the air as we get closer to an object. These two phenomena work together in a powerful way to help us perceive objects and their distance from us, right? It takes some practice to both perceive and use the information effectively. Incorporating its use in orientation and mobility is an extremely valuable tool, both indoors and out, okay? So not only are people learning about it in this exercise, but through practice, they're gonna begin to trust that it actually is a real thing. Because a lot of people, when I explain this to them, look at me like I'm crazy. Like, I don't know how this is gonna work, okay? But it does. So here's how the exercise goes. You want to place the sound source about 15 feet away from the student, okay? Ask the student to walk slowly towards the sound source. So you're going to put on your phone or radio at a low decibel level, right? Something soft, right? Ask them to walk slowly towards the sound source. No cane if possible, because the cane will create its own echo as the client taps towards that sound source. So you want to do this in an environment that they feel safe and comfortable in, okay? And you're going to ask them to walk towards the sound source, and then you're going to ask them to stop when they perceive that that there's an object in front of them. And that object is going to be you holding up that flat panel, okay? After they begin walking, then you place yourself between the student and the sound source, okay, quietly. Hold up the panel so that it's at the level of their face, okay? Wherever their face is, you want to hold it up. So picture this, the sound source is behind you, the client is walking towards you, right? And you are holding up the panel in front of their face, which might be the same as your face, okay? And you're going to ask them to be aware, because you've explained how this is going to work. You're going to ask them to be aware of just sensing something in front of them, okay? And you're going to ask them to stop when they feel they're close to this object. I say be aware of the sensations that they'll feel on their face and their ears as they approach the object, and ask them to stop when they perceive that they're 1 or 2 feet away. Often the first or second attempt at this will be unsuccessful. The student will either bump right into the object, okay, and you're going to be there to make sure they're walking at a nice slow pace, right? Or they're going to stop maybe 5 feet away, thinking they perceive something, but maybe they really don't. Okay, and you can let them know. You can say, "Oh, you're several feet away from this," or if they're right up next to it, you can put their hand on it. Now, something that I have not talked about in these exercises, and this is, I apologize, you want to ask the client to close their eyes when they do this, right? If you have a pair of blindfold and they trust that this is a teaching tool that they will help them to learn these skills, that would be great. I always use a pair of blindfold, and I explain very clearly it's not to make a person feel more blind than they are. It's simply a tool that will allow them to attend to non-visual information, because it will be blocking out any light that might be confusing or anything else that would be visual. If they don't feel comfortable or you don't have the blindfold, they can simply close their eyes. Okay. So often, as I said, it doesn't work the first time, and that's fine. That's perfectly normal. So then I might have them do it again. And you want to make sure the environment's very quiet. And you repeat the exercise, being as quiet as possible. And again, ask them to pay attention to the sensation. And honestly, 9 times out of 10, they will start to learn to sense or pick up on this feeling when they get close to the object. And it can be a very, very powerful exercise for people. And you might say to them, and I've heard this from a coworker of mine, a coworker of mine who's blind says, I move around my house all the time without bumping into anything, not just because I know the layout, but I sense when I'm getting near objects, and I adjust myself accordingly. Right? And all O&M instructors might be using this technique as they teach people to walk a straight line between maybe a parallel sound source and maybe some trees or a brick wall or something like that. They can feel as they get closer to the wall and feel as they get away from it. Some students will experience what we call a sound shadow. They might know when they're close to the board, not because they're using this newfound sense of spatial vision, but because the sound that they're listening for becomes quieter because they're getting very close to the board, and the board is acting as a kind of a muffler. Right? So that's a whole nother, using sound shadows is a whole nother lesson, which I would do at a different time. But if they experience that, you might say, why did you stop there? And they'll say, oh, the sound was very quiet. And they might be using the sound shadow to help them. And that's fine. You could say it's a great thing. And when you get outdoors, you'll be able to start to use sound shadows all the time. If you're walking, down the street and your cars are going by and they go by a telephone pole, that telephone pole blocks the sound of the car for just a second or two. That's a sound shadow. It's almost like the shadow you would feel from if the sun is blocked as you're walking by the trunk of a tree. Okay, so that's spatial vision. It's very, very powerful. It takes some time for folks. And at the end, I'm going to talk about some barriers to learning all of these things, but I want to mention this one now. If a person has a difficult time hearing, they might be trying to listen for something that they're not going to hear. I always tell people facial vision is as much about the receptors in your skin as it is about hearing itself. So even a person who does not have great hearing can often start to master this use of their what we call facial vision or object detection. All right, any questions about that exercise? I'm being mindful of the time here. Oh, yikes. Yeah, that that might do it for our exercises, because I do want to leave time. Jennifer, what do you think? Should I open it up for questions at this point, or do I have time for one more exercise?
Yeah, why don't we, if you can quickly go through the last exercise, that will be
Yes.
great. And then what we can do, Paul's willing to stay on for a couple
Yep.
more minutes to answer questions if you have them, but we'll be sure to give the closing code as close to 4 o'clock as we can, in case any of you have to leave. So, but yeah, I'll be quiet so you can jump in with the last exercise.
Okay. Okay. And I apologize for running through this last one quickly. This last exercise is called shape walking. Okay. A student can improve their kinesthetic abilities by carefully monitoring their movement as they move through space, paying particular attention to their sense of turn. This awareness improves the student's ability to orient themselves and to remain oriented as they move about. So as a former mobility instructor, I know one of the most difficult things is to walk a straight line, right? To travel a straight line, to walk in a place where you're not aware of the changes, the turns that you're making. A person can become very disoriented very quickly if they're not aware that they're actually turning their body when they don't intend to. So very quickly, using a sound source, we did this indoors in a quiet room. We use a sound source 10 feet away from the client, right? Could be your phone or your a radio, okay? you're going to ask the student with the walking towards the sound source if they can make letters or shapes that you ask them to make. So I would put the phone on and I would say, listen to that music. I want you to make an N, a giant N, which means you have to walk towards the sound source, and at some point you have to walk away from it, putting it on your right shoulder, and then you're going to have to walk back towards it, but it should look like an N. So you need to think about where you are in relation to that sound source. And you want to think about what the letter N looks like. If they're not familiar with letters, if they're a person who doesn't do print, you could ask them to make a big square. Okay, so put the sound source in front of them, walk towards that sound source, then they would have to make a right-hand turn, then it would have to make another right-hand turn, another right-hand turn, and walk back to the sound source. This is a very difficult exercise. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's difficult at first. Clients are trying to pay attention to where their body is turning, right? How long a leg, for example, let's use the square. How long each leg of the square should be to make it a square, right? So you would be asking the client, think about how far away from you from the radio you are, right? How many steps does it take to get to the radio? And then when you take a right-hand turn, how you should walk the same number of steps away from that sound source, right? And then when you make another right-hand turn, you should be making the same amount of steps. It's giving a person a lot of things to think about, but allowing them to focus in on their sense of turn with a sound source in the room, right? I start with something very easy, and then I go to more difficult things like maybe the letter P or an S. Those are hard because you don't have those hard right and left turns, right? Those are more gradual turns that you have to be thinking of. And what I do in this exercise is I will write down on my notepad what shape the person is making. If I ask them to make an X and they make a long rectangle, right? I will, when the exercise is over, I'll go up to the student and with their hand, I will draw the shape that they made as they were walking. So I'll say, I wanted you to make a square, and I'll make the sign of a square with my finger onto their palm. And I'll say, here's the shape that you made. It was a long, skinny rectangle. And which is fine. I'll tell them this is what we're here for. We're learning about this. Can you do this again, thinking about the four equilateral sides of a square? It's a very, very powerful exercise that gets people to think about their own movement in space and using a sound source as that orientation point. And when they graduate onto more difficult things, you can take them outside and do it with the sun as a source of orientation, or maybe traffic sounds, right? Or simply the slope of a driveway, okay? So that's a quick down and dirty exercise for shape walking. So those three exercises, TKG, shape walking, and what was the middle one now? I forgot. Spatial vision are kind of the basis for some of the instruction that went on at the Carroll Center for years and years in sensory training. And I do want to mention before we leave that the Carroll Center has available the printed material that includes these lessons. Unfortunately, they're not in accessible form, and it's only because they were illustrated by me years and years ago. And we're in the process of trying to make these totally accessible, taking out the illustrations with descriptors. But if you are interested in the printed form of these exercises, the Carroll Center has the original training manual available, and I can give that information to Jennifer. All right, any questions? I know we're right at 3:59. Any questions or comments from anyone?
This has been OIB-TAC's monthly webinar. Thanks for tuning in. Find recordings of our past webinars on our YouTube channel and discover all of our many resources at oib-tac.org. That's oib-tac.org. Like us on social media and share our resources with your colleagues and friends. Until next time.
The closed-in code is DLE. That's D as in Delta, L as in Lima, and E as in Echo. DLE.